On Monday, I talked about a story and a study that involved forensic analysis to find out how much from an artisanal fishery in Costa Rica were sharks being caught and what that could mean for marine protected areas. Today, I'm talking about more scientific detective work from an article written by Speak Up for Blue Network's very own Melissa Cristina Marquez, who wrote an article in Forbes talking about a study that looked at how, shark fin trafficking around the globe works and how we can detect where the shark fins are coming from and what that means for management in the future. That's what we're going to talk about on today's episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Today we're talking about a story in Forbes magazine that involves a story written by our very own Melissa Marquez, who is doing her PhD in Australia, but she's also a contributor for Forbes magazine. She's also a novelist. She's also just an amazing person and the host of our Conciencia Azul, our Spanish Speak Up for Blue podcast. That's in a bit of a hiatus, but I have a feeling it's going to come back soon. But she's just an amazing person, wrote a great article in Forbes magazine on shark fins and where they're coming from. Now, we know the problem with shark fins hasn't really gone away. We know that they're still around. People are still shark finning, which essentially, I'm going to define it, essentially is the act of going out at sea, catching sharks, cutting the fins off, while the sharks are alive, throwing them back while the sharks are alive, and keeping the fins. They do that over and over and over again, and it goes against a lot of countries' policies, including like something like Canada's, where you have to bring the entire shark back, and there's a reason for that. You bring the entire shark back because it fills up your boat. If you put the shark over and just keep the fins, you can fit a lot more fins in, which is not very sustainable. If you bring the entire shark back and you use the fins because you've used the entire shark carcass, then it's a little bit more sustainable. You're not catching as many sharks, you're not destroying as many sharks, and you're not destroying and altering as many habitats, as well as a lot of shark species. Unfortunately, in the Eastern Pacific, near Costa Rica, Honduras, maybe that's not Honduras, sorry. Honduras, I believe. I'm not very familiar with my Central America countries. My apologies. But instead, in the Eastern Pacific, we see this a lot with shark fins. It's had a lot of problems, all the way from the movie From Shark Water, where, the basis of the story around looking at all these shark fins were by Rob Stewart was most of it was talked about in the setting, in the location of Costa Rica. We also found that in the last year, there was a bit of an international news item, a big international news story that came out that had a lot of boats, about 350 vessels from China that were fishing along on the outskirts, or staying around the outskirts of a marine protected area outside the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are known for their diversity in sharks and abundance of sharks. And so they're going in and they're fishing illegally, right? And this happens a lot. When we look at Chinese vessels, we know that Chinese fisheries vessels, they do fish illegally, especially for sharks, for shark fins, which is used for shark fin soup. It's a very popular delicacy in China. It has gone down in terms of what's happening in shark finning, but it's still around. It's still fairly prominent. The study that was talked about in Melissa's article was essentially by two scientists at the Florida International University, Dr. Damian Chapman and Dr. Diego Cardonoza. They were working to find out where these shark fins that were grabbed in markets, grabbed in airports, and grabbed in other places, where they were grabbed and analyzed to find out where they were actually from. So the analysis was developed by the two researchers, and let me just find where that is at the end of they said their testing kit was created with funding from the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation. It's been used in airports and shipping ports to help customs officials identify protected shark species. So essentially it's a DNA work for the field. There's a lot of illegal trade, and sharks, there's a number of sharks that are on the CITES list, which is, I always forget what it stands for, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species and of Wild Fauna and Flora. So essentially, this is a list of species that cannot be traded, that cannot be internationally traded. So that means they cannot be exported, they cannot be imported into countries without having special permissions. So I'm not saying they can't, but they usually can't because they're protected. So for a while there, I was involved in marine aquariums. I really liked a lot of reefs. I found out that a lot of coral reefs were on the CITES list because it was protected, and they couldn't, because what was happening is they would grab, fishers would grab a number of different coral, Acropora to be specific, and they would ship them out, but they would take all of them, and they wouldn't be sustainable at all. So they had to stop the actual trade of this international trade of this species, so that it wouldn't destroy the reefs, the wild reefs, essentially. So let's get back. But CITES is an important tool, international tool, to stop illegal trade of fish, of mammals, of anything, really, land and at sea. It's a pretty effective tool. It allows for customs agents to really look at these things. But what's difficult, though, is that when you get a shipment, right, and this happens a lot. I remember speaking to an enforcement officer at Environment Canada here in Canada and talking about, like, I live near Toronto, and Pearson Airport is a huge international airport. It gets a lot of shipments, and he says you wouldn't believe the amount of legal shipments you get, illegal animal shipments you would get at Pearson. And they come in crates. They're hidden all over the place. They're there at most of the time trying to, basically just interrupt these supply chains. And so he would be there with his team, and they would be there, and they would try and get involved and interrupt all these supply chains. And he would do it. And it was amazing to see him do it. But then you're just like, holy cow, that's a lot of stuff that would come in. There'd be rhino horns, ivory tusks, there'd be shark fins, there'd be everything that came across. This, going back to this study, though, this study was able to take basically shark fins from in Hong Kong at markets and be able to test them using DNA testing and find out that they're from the Eastern Pacific. So what's happening is you have a lot of Chinese vessels or other vessels that are going to the Eastern Pacific, so Central America, basically, and they are grabbing sharks. This is all along. It could be Galapagos, it could be Central America, it could even be North America, the west coast of North America, or even South America. And they could be illegally fishing. Nobody knows because it's very hard to enforce on the water. And then they bring it back to China to sell, especially into Hong Kong. Hong Kong is like a known shark fin hub for this type of thing. It's a huge port city. It has a lot of shipments coming in, and it's a big port for this kind of stuff. So this is, and there's a reason for it. The Eastern Pacific, where they're fishing, is a region, as Cardozo says, is a region with poor fisheries management and poor capacity to enforce international regulations. So they're just not equipped for this type of stuff. Now, with this knowledge, like, what do we do with this knowledge? We say, okay, now we need to beef up the management in the Eastern Pacific. We need to make sure that we can look at the Eastern Pacific and say, we can actually deal with this. We can actually do something that will help manage these, use tools like CITES, use other international regulations, or come up with other international regulations, and start, telling people, right? Start using enforcement, put more money in enforcement, right? I know a lot of times in Costa Rica especially, there's a huge ecotourism industry. And they've heavily invested in education. They've heavily invested into ecotourism and environment. Well, I would imagine a lot of that investment could be taken in and put into enforcement to make sure that their environment is still intact, because you can't have much ecotourism if you're not taking care of your environment. And I think that is a really interesting conundrum to have as a government, to be able to not only tout your environmental responsibility, right? Because there are a lot of times Costa Rica is in the news for the forefront of like banning plastics and so forth, but then you have the enforcement aspect as well, which is not an easy thing to do, but you do have that enforcement aspect that you need to invest in, and you need to start putting resources in order to be able to enforce the environmental protections that you've actually put in, you've advertised to the rest of the world. And that is a huge component of environmental responsibility that a lot of countries, not only Costa Rica, but a lot of countries in the world, Canada, the US, have to be able to invest in if they want to protect certain aspects of their environment, right? So this article goes through a lot of stuff. I'm going to link to it into the show notes, but it's a really interesting, sort of interesting area, because especially with China coming in, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, with China coming in with a lot of their new regulations on their distance fishing fleet, right? And so now they have, if you're not familiar with that, they've changed a lot of the rules in that so they can get on committees that have to do with ports around the world. You have to have specific regulations against illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which is IUU fishing. So they've started to implement more policies around that and enforcing those policies, where if Chinese fishing vessels come back to China with illegal hauls and they're found to be illegal, and they're proven to be illegal, then the consequences are a lot more dire, including a 3-year suspension of license for the captain, as well as a 3-year suspension for the manager that is managing the product. So I assume that's in the higher up company that is contracting the fishing vessels and so forth and paying for all this to happen. So before, it used to be you pay a fine, you go back, you turn around, you go back out. The fine was less than what it would cost to actually get the fish and sell the fish. So they were actually making money even with the fine. So now there's a bit more of a dire need, because the captains, the managers are paying more of a price. Will that be enforced in China is another question. It was put into place in 2020, April of 2020. We will see if that is enforced. And it's very difficult, obviously, because China is not one to share its information with the Western world, let's just say. So it's very difficult to find out if it's actually being effective. The only way to really see is if we start seeing less fishing boats that are coming out, because I can't imagine a lot of fishing boats in international fisheries coming out from China if they can't get their illegal catch. Obviously, the legal catch is not doing it for them. That's why they're going for the illegal catch. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops, especially when it comes to shark fishing and illegal shark catches, especially with shark finning. So, and also it'll be interesting to see if, with this information, if the Eastern Pacific countries that are being targeted by Chinese fishing vessels for these sharks, if they're actually going to beef up their enforcement, if they're going to beef up using their tools and enforce that fisheries management policy. So we're going to find out about those, I'm sure, over the next few years. I would love to know what you think. Do you think this is going to happen? Do you think China's going to enforce their new policies on fishing? And do you think the Eastern Pacific countries are going to be able to enforce or even create policies that help in deterring and reducing illegal trade in shark fins and shark fisheries in general? Love to hear your thoughts. Go to the Speak Up for Blue Facebook group at speakupforblue.com/group. That's where we go to talk all things oceans. And don't forget, you can still register for the Mindful Conservation Conference at the link in the show notes, which is absolutely smashing, llc.com. There's a link in the show notes to register. It's $20 to register for the first 4 days. The extra 2 days, Friday and Saturday, are optional, but I highly recommend that you do it. I've talked about it on the show before. There's some great workshops on Friday and Saturday that I highly recommend you do this. It helps us get through articles like this when we find out that a lot of the shark finning is still done in the Eastern Pacific. That's a hard thing to swallow as a conservationist, and so sometimes you need a different type of thought process going through conservation. The Mindful Conservation Conference can do that for you, so I highly recommend that you pay the $20 to do this virtual conference. It's very much worth it. I'll be presenting on science communication and social media. It's going to be very interesting, and I can't wait to do that, but there's going to be a lot of other things that are going on. So highly recommend that you join that. But that's at the end of our episode for today. Thank you, Melissa Marquez, for writing this wonderful article and letting us know about all things sharks, because she does that all the time. I'm going to put a link to her bio for Forbes. You can check out a lot of the different articles that are out there. It's very, very interesting, especially if you are a shark fanatic. I highly recommend. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you on Monday. and happy conservation.